A walk into the unknown. Elise Langley was known around her small rural town in Idaho as the animal whisperer. From a young age, she had an uncanny ability to communicate with animals, understanding their needs and emotions in a way that astounded even experienced veterinarians. Growing up on her family farm, she learned the rhythms of nature, the cycles of life, birth, and sometimes death. But one thing she could never accept was cruelty to animals. At 29, Elise had recently returned to the family farm after a challenging few years away. She had gone to veterinary school with the hope of working in animal rescue, but left halfway through due to financial strains. Though disappointed, she had not given up her dream of helping animals. Elise poured her energy into the farm, caring for the cows, pigs, goats, and horses that had been in her family for generations. Every day, she took time to walk around the farm, checking on the animals, making sure they were healthy, and spending time with them. The animals were her solace, especially after the stress of leaving her studies behind. One fall afternoon, the air was crisp with the scent of autumn leaves. Elise was taking her usual walk around the farthest edge of the farm, near a forested area that bordered an old, dilapidated barn. The barn had been abandoned for as long as she could remember, its roof caved in, walls sagging with age. No one went there, as it was said to be dangerous and falling apart. On that day, as Elise passed the edge of the property, she heard something unusual, a faint but distinct noise. It was a sound she couldn't quite place, somewhere between a whinny and a groan. Pausing, she listened closely. The sound came again, this time louder, more desperate. Her heart began to race as she moved toward the old barn. It was a strange feeling, a combination of dread and determination. The closer she got to the barn, the more pungent the smell became. Rotten, sour, like something long neglected. Elise covered her nose with her sleeve, but kept moving. When she finally reached the barn, she hesitated, staring at the cracked, peeling door. It was slightly ajar, just enough for a sliver of light to slip through. The strange noises, now clearer, came from inside. They sounded like animals in pain. Pushing the door open with a creak, Elise was hit by a wave of foul air. The smell was overwhelming, but it wasn't just the odor that made her stomach churn. What lay before her was beyond her worst imagination. Inside the barn were horses, at least 8 of them, tied to rusty iron bars along the walls. Their skeletal bodies were riddled with sores, and their eyes were dull, filled with fear and exhaustion. Some of the horses lay on the filthy straw-covered floor, too weak to stand, while others swayed on their feet, their legs trembling from the effort to remain upright. Elise's heart stopped for a moment, then raced as adrenaline surged through her body. She moved closer, her eyes filling with tears as she took in the full horror of what she was seeing. These horses had been abandoned, left here to die, tied up and starved for who knew how long. The youngest ones were in the worst condition, foals no more than a few months old, their small bodies nothing but skin and bones. It was impossible for Elise to imagine how anyone could do this, how anyone could treat living creatures with such cruelty. She wanted to scream, to call for help, but there was no one nearby. Her farm was the only one within miles, and the nearest town was a good hour's drive away. For a moment, she was paralyzed, unsure of what to do. The horse's eyes followed her, pleading for help. One of the younger foals let out a weak, pitiful cry, breaking the silence. That sound jolted Elise into action. Without wasting another second, she pulled out her phone and dialed the local animal rescue hotline. As the phone rang, Elise snapped photos of the horses, wanting to document the horrifying state they were in for the authorities. When the dispatcher answered, Elise's voice shook as she described what she had found. 8 horses, tied up and starving. Some of them can't even stand. You have to send someone, please. They're dying. The dispatcher assured her that help was on the way, but Elise knew it could take time. She couldn't just stand there and wait while these animals suffered. Moving quickly, she found a knife in a toolbox near the entrance and began cutting the ropes that held the horses captive. The ropes had rubbed their skin raw, leaving deep gashes around their necks and legs. Some of the horses flinched as she approached, too weak to resist, but clearly terrified of humans after what they had endured. Elise moved from horse to horse, cutting each one free. The moment she cut the rope binding a particularly large mare, the horse collapsed onto the ground with a heavy thud. Elise's heart leaped into her throat, fearing the worst. She knelt beside the mare, gently touching its neck. It was still breathing, but barely. "I'm here," Elise whispered softly. "I'm not going to leave you." One by one, she freed the others, but their condition was dire. Time passed in a blur as she worked, whispering comforting words to the horses, trying to calm them down. She wished she had food or water to give them, but there was nothing around. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Elise heard the sound of approaching vehicles. The rescue team had arrived, a team of veterinarians, animal control officers, and volunteers rushed into the barn, and Elise explained the situation as they quickly began assessing the horses' conditions. They worked quickly, setting up makeshift IV drips to rehydrate the horses and transporting them to the waiting trucks. The team was professional, calm, but even they couldn't hide their shock at the sight before them. One of the vets, an older man with a grizzled beard, turned to Elise after examining the mare she had been sitting with. "She's in bad shape, but we'll do everything we can," he said, his voice grim but determined. Elise nodded, her emotions a tangled mess of relief and sorrow. The horses were finally getting the help they needed, but the question lingered in her mind. How had this happened? Who had done this to these innocent animals? As the last horse was loaded into the truck, Elise stood outside the barn, watching the rescue team prepare to leave. She was exhausted, both physically and emotionally, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something more was happening here, something deeper and more sinister than just neglect. She had stumbled upon something terrible, but perhaps there was more to uncover. Before the trucks pulled away, the older vet approached Elise once more. "We'll take care of them, but you might want to keep your eyes open around here. Sometimes when you find something like this, it's just the tip of the iceberg." Elise nodded, her resolve hardening. She had saved these horses today, but she knew this wasn't the end of the story. Something was wrong in this town, and she intended to find out what. As she watched the rescue trucks drive off into the distance, Elise made a silent promise to herself. She wouldn't rest until she found the people responsible for this cruelty and ensured that no other animals would suffer the same fate. Uncovering the shadows. The evening sun was casting long shadows as Elise stood alone in front of the now empty barn. The hollow structure felt like a graveyard, its silence more deafening than the horses' desperate cries earlier. With the rescue trucks gone, a cold breeze rustled through the broken windows, carrying the lingering stench of decay and abandonment. Elise inhaled deeply, forcing herself to take in the scene once more, as if to etch it into her memory. The smell would fade, the sight would blur in time, but she didn't want to forget. She needed to remember everything. Who had done this? And why? As she walked back to her farmhouse, the question swirled in her mind like leaves caught in the wind. Elise knew that people could be cruel, but this felt like something more insidious, an operation that had gone unnoticed for far too long. She had always been aware of the occasional rumors in town about illegal animal trades, but nothing had ever come close to home. Now she wasn't sure if the quiet, sleepy town she grew up in was as innocent as it appeared. That night, Elise found it impossible to sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the emaciated bodies of the horses, their hollow, pleading eyes staring back at her. She tossed and turned, her mind racing. She needed to act, but where could she even begin? At dawn, she made a decision. She would start by contacting the authorities, but not just animal control. This needed to be bigger. She wanted to find out if there had been any other reports of mistreated or abandoned animals in the area, and if there hadn't been, well, that would only deepen her suspicion that something was being covered up. Elise dressed quickly and grabbed her keys. Her husband, Max, who had been out on a work trip for the past few days, would be back by evening, but she didn't want to wait for his return to start digging. Max had always been supportive of her love for animals, but she didn't want to drag him into this until she had more solid evidence. He was more practical, less emotional about these things, and sometimes that made it hard for him to see the urgency she felt. She also wanted to protect him from the worrying gnawing at her insides. This could get dangerous if she was right about what was happening. She headed straight to the sheriff's office in town, determined to report what she had found. As she entered the small building, the musty smell of old files and coffee greeted her. The sheriff, Robert "Body" Jensen, was an old family friend. He'd known Elise since she was a little girl running around her father's farm. His easygoing demeanor had always made him approachable, but as Elise walked in, she couldn't help but feel a pang of doubt. Bobby had a reputation for being laid back, sometimes too much so. Would he take her seriously? "Elise, good to see you." Bobby greeted her with a smile, looking up from behind his cluttered desk. "What brings you in this early? Something wrong with one of your animals?" His tone was casual, but Elise's expression quickly wiped the smile from his face. "It's not about my animals, Bobby. It's worse. I found something yesterday, something terrible," Elise began, her voice shaking slightly. She explained everything, how she had heard the noises, found the horses, and called animal rescue. She showed him the photos on her phone, which made Bobby sit up straight in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "Goddamn," he muttered under his breath. "I didn't hear about any of this yet. You said the rescue team came out already." "Yes, but that's just it. I think this is part of something bigger. Those horses didn't end up there by accident, and someone left them to die. What if this is some kind of illegal animal trade operation? There could be more of them suffering out there right now, and we don't even know." Bobby leaned back in his chair, scratching the stubble on his chin. "I've heard rumors before, but nothing concrete. We've had a few cases of livestock theft here and there, but animal trafficking, that's a whole different beast. You're thinking this is organized?" Elise nodded, feeling more certain by the minute. "Yes, and I need your help to figure it out." Bobby sighed, rubbing his forehead. "All right, I'll file an official report. But I'm gonna be honest with you, Elise. We're a small-town sheriff's office. We don't have the resources to launch some big investigation into this. I can reach out to state authorities, maybe get them to look into it, but it might take time." "Time is what these animals don't have, Bobby," Elise said, her frustration boiling over. "You didn't see what I saw. They're barely alive, and I'm worried there's more going on here than we realize." Bobby held up his hand, signaling for her to calm down. "I hear you. I'll make the calls today. But in the meantime, don't go playing detective on your own, okay? Leave this to the professionals." Elise nodded, but as she left the office, she knew that wasn't an option. Bobby would do his best, but the wheels of official investigations turned slowly. Too slowly. If she wanted to get to the bottom of this, she'd have to do some digging of her own. Back at the farm, Elise sat at her kitchen table with her laptop, trying to find anything that might connect the horses she found to a larger operation. She searched for articles on illegal animal trade, looked up recent arrests in nearby counties, but nothing seemed to fit. It was as if the horses had been dumped there and forgotten. But why? Suddenly, a thought struck her. The old barn where she found the horses, it hadn't always been abandoned. Years ago, before it fell into disrepair, it had been part of a larger estate owned by the Huxley family, a wealthy and reclusive group that had once dominated the local farming industry. The Huxleys had moved away years ago, but their influence still lingered in town. People whispered about their strange dealings and the way they had suddenly left without warning. Elise couldn't shake the feeling that there was a connection between the Huxleys and what she had found. She had never met them personally, but her parents had always spoken cautiously about the family, especially after they sold off their land and disappeared. Could the Huxleys be behind this, or had someone taken over their old property for illegal purposes? Elise decided to start by talking to her closest neighbors, especially those who had been around long enough to remember the Huxleys. If anyone knew anything about what had happened to the family, or if they had noticed anything suspicious recently, they might be able to point her in the right direction. As she prepared to leave, her phone buzzed with a message from Max. "Hey, just landed. Be home in a few hours. Everything okay?" Elise hesitated. She didn't want to worry him until she had more information, so she responded simply, "All good. See you soon." But deep down, Elise knew that things were far from okay. Something dark was lurking beneath the surface of this quiet town, and she was determined to uncover the truth, no matter how dangerous it might be. She grabbed her jacket, got into her truck, and headed toward the nearest neighbor's house, hoping that someone would have the answers she needed. Into the heart of secrets. Elise's hands tightened on the steering wheel as she drove down the winding country road that led to her nearest neighbor, Jim Hadley. His farm was only about a mile away from hers, but it felt like a world apart. Jim was an older man, in his late 60s, and had lived in the area for as long as Elise could remember. He was a gruff man, not particularly social, but he had an encyclopedic knowledge of the land and its history, including the families who had come and gone over the years. If anyone knew anything about the Huxleys, it would be him. As she approached Jim's house, Elise couldn't help but notice how his property seemed to mirror the fading season. The once thriving farm had started to wither, much like its owner. The fields, which had once grown tall with crops, now lay barren, overgrown with weeds. The barn leaned to one side, its red paint peeling in long, thin strips. A couple of sheep grazed lazily in a fenced-off area, their coats unkempt, much like Jim himself. Pulling into the driveway, Elise saw Jim on the porch, rocking slowly in a chair, his rifle propped up against the door beside him. He was wearing his usual uniform of worn jeans and a flannel shirt that had probably seen decades of farm work. His face was weathered by years of sun and toil, his eyes sharp beneath his bushy eyebrows. "Afternoon, Elise." Jim greeted her in his deep, gravelly voice as she stepped out of her truck. "What brings you out this way?" "Afternoon, Jim," Elise said, walking up to the porch. "I need to ask you about something. Something serious." Jim raised an eyebrow, the lines on his forehead deepening. "Sounds like trouble." "You could say that," Elise replied. She took a seat on the porch steps and briefly recounted what had happened with the horses she found in the old Huxley barn. Jim's expression didn't change much, but his eyes narrowed slightly as he listened. When she finished, Jim let out a long, slow breath. "Those Huxleys," he muttered, almost to himself. "Never thought I'd hear that name again." Elise leaned forward. "What do you mean? Do you know what happened to them?" "I've been trying to figure out if they're involved somehow. The barn I found the horses in, it used to be theirs, didn't it?" Jim nodded slowly, his gaze distant as if recalling memories from a time long gone. "Yep, that barn was part of their property. The Huxleys were complicated folk, had a lot of money, and they didn't like to mix with us regular folk much, kept to themselves. People said they were into some shady dealings, but no one could ever prove anything. They up and left about 15 years ago, sold off their land to some development company, but nothing ever came of it. Place has been rotting ever since." "Do you think they were involved in illegal activity?" Elise asked, her heart pounding in her chest. "Like animal trafficking?" Jim shrugged, scratching at his chin. "Hard to say. There were rumors, sure. But if they were into something illegal, they covered their tracks real good. No one ever got close enough to know for sure. After they left, the town just sort of moved on. Place was abandoned, and no one cared to ask too many questions." Elise frowned, her mind racing. If the Huxleys were involved in something, then maybe whoever was behind the horses now had picked up where they left off. The barn had been untouched for years, but someone had clearly been using it recently. That much was obvious from the state of the horses. "Do you know if anyone's been around the old Huxley place lately?" Elise asked, trying to piece together the puzzle. Anyone suspicious? Jim took a moment to think, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the arm of the rocking chair. There's been some movement over there in the last few months. A couple of black SUVs rolling in and out at night. I didn't think much of it. Figured it was just developers checking the land again. But they never came during the day. Always late at night. I didn't see who was in them, but it seemed off. Elise felt a chill run down her spine. Black SUVs. Late-night visits to an abandoned property. It fit too well with the idea of a secret operation. She couldn't shake the feeling that whoever was behind those visits was tied to the horses she had found. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" Elise asked, her voice tinged with frustration. Jim gave her a sideways look. "Elise, you've lived here long enough to know how things work in these parts. You don't go sticking your nose into business that ain't yours, especially when it comes to rich folk and their dealings. Folks who ask too many questions around here tend to find themselves in bad situations." Elise wanted to argue, but she understood what Jim meant. The town had always had an unspoken rule about minding your own business. People kept quiet, even when they suspected something wasn't right. It was easier to look the other way, especially when powerful people were involved. But Elise wasn't willing to stay silent. "Thanks for the warning, Jim," she said, standing up. "But I can't let this go. Those horses were suffering, and there could be more of them. I have to find out who's behind this." Jim nodded slowly, his eyes softening. "You've always had a big heart, Elise. Just be careful. You start poking around where you don't belong, and you might stir up something bigger than you can handle." Elise didn't respond as she walked back to her truck. Jim's words echoed in her mind, but they didn't deter her. If anything, they fueled her determination. Whoever was responsible for this was still out there, and she wasn't going to stop until she found them. As she drove away from Jim's farm, Elise's mind churned with possibilities. The black SUVs, the Huxleys, the horses, it was all connected somehow. She just had to figure out how. Back at her farm, Max had returned and was unloading his bags from his truck. He smiled when he saw her pull in, but his expression quickly shifted when he saw the look on her face. "Hey, what's going on?" Max asked as Elise got out of her truck. "You look like you've been through the ringer." "I found something yesterday, and it's bad, Max," she said, her voice heavy with the weight of what she had seen. "I found a barn full of starving horses. I think someone's been using the old Huxley place for something illegal." Max's eyes widened, his brow furrowing with concern. "Starving horses? What the hell? I called animal rescue, and they took them in. But I think it's bigger than just some abandoned horses. I talked to Jim, and he mentioned seeing black SUVs out there at night. I'm starting to think there's some kind of trafficking operation going on." Max ran a hand through his hair, his face a mix of disbelief and concern. "That's a lot, Elise. Are you sure about this?" "I'm sure. Something's wrong, Max, and I can't just walk away from it." Max sighed, clearly torn. "I get it, but this sounds dangerous. If there's really something going on out there, you need to let the authorities handle it." "I've already talked to the sheriff," Elise replied. "But I can't sit around and wait while more animals might be suffering. I need to figure out who's behind this." Max stepped closer, taking her hand in his. "I know you want to help, but I don't want you getting hurt. These kinds of people, if they're willing to hurt animals like that, what do you think they'll do to you if they catch you snooping around?" Elise looked up at him, her resolve unwavering. "I'm not afraid of them, Max. I have to do this." Max's shoulders slumped slightly as he let out a resigned breath. "All right, but if you're going to keep digging, you're not doing it alone. We'll figure this out together." Elise smiled, grateful for his support. "Thank you." Later that night, as they sat together at the kitchen table, Max pulled up a map of the area on his laptop. They traced the roads and properties around the old Huxley place, trying to piece together a plan. Elise felt a strange mixture of fear and anticipation. The mystery was unraveling, but the deeper they went, the more dangerous it seemed to become. Suddenly, Elise's phone buzzed with a new message. She glanced at it and froze. The message was from an unknown number. "Stop looking, or you'll regret it." A cold chill ran down her spine as she stared at the screen. Someone knew. Someone was watching. And now, it wasn't just about the horses. It was about her. The web of danger tightens. Elise's heart pounded as she stared at the cryptic message on her phone. The words felt like a threat, cold and deliberate, creeping into her veins like ice. Her fingers hovered over the screen, her mind racing. Who had sent this? How did they know she was investigating? And more importantly, how much did they know about her? Max leaned over her shoulder, his brow furrowed in concern as he read the text. His face darkened with a mixture of anger and fear. "Who the hell is that?" he muttered, grabbing his own phone. "This isn't just some coincidence. Someone's watching us." "I don't know," Elise replied, her voice barely a whisper. "But they know what we're doing, Max. They know we're digging into this." Max sat down heavily, his face tense. "We need to take this seriously. Whoever sent that message, they're trying to scare you off, which means you're on the right track. But this also means it's dangerous." Elise felt the weight of his words sink in, but the fire in her chest refused to die out. She wasn't someone who backed down from a challenge, and whoever had sent this message didn't realize that threats would only fuel her determination. But she had to admit, Max was right. They were dealing with people who clearly had no qualms about cruelty, and now it was clear they were willing to use intimidation to protect their secrets. "I'm not going to stop," Elise said, her voice steady. "But we have to be smart about this. We can't just charge in blindly." Max nodded, still gripping his phone tightly. "You're right. We need to get ahead of this. But first, we need to figure out who sent that text." Elise looked at the message again. The number was blocked, and there were no identifying details. Whoever sent it had gone through great lengths to stay hidden. Max quickly began researching ways to trace unknown numbers, but after several attempts, he hit a wall. The number was completely untraceable. "Whoever's behind this knows what they're doing," Max said grimly. "They're covering their tracks well. We won't be able to trace this unless we get professional help." "Professional help?" Elise asked, her brow raised. "Yeah," Max said, standing up and pacing. "We might need to hire someone, a private investigator or a tech expert who can dig deeper into this. But that's going to take time and money." Elise sighed, frustration gnawing at her. They didn't have the luxury of waiting around while more animals could be suffering, but going in blind felt like a recipe for disaster. She needed more information, more clues that would help her figure out who was behind this without putting herself, or anyone else, in harm's way. Suddenly, an idea flashed in her mind. "What about Jim?" she asked. Max stopped pacing and looked at her. "Jim? You think he'd know more?" "Maybe," Elise said, thinking it over. "He's lived here for so long, and he already mentioned seeing those black SUVs. What if we go back and ask him if he's seen anything else suspicious? He might not have told me everything when I was there earlier." Max frowned, clearly uncertain. "I don't know, Elise. Jim seemed pretty spooked by all this. You think he'll really want to help us dig deeper?" "Maybe not," Elise admitted, "but it's worth a shot. He knows this area better than anyone, and if there's something going on around here, he might have noticed other things too. We won't know unless we ask." Max nodded slowly. "All right, let's go see him again. But we need to be careful. We don't know how deep this goes, and now that someone's watching us, we have to assume they could be watching him too." With that unsettling thought hanging in the air, Elise and Max gathered their things and prepared to head back to Jim's farm. The message weighed heavily on Elise's mind, but her resolve was unshaken. She couldn't abandon those horses, or any other animals that might be suffering because of this operation. The unknown number had intended to scare her into silence, but instead, it had only sharpened her focus. The drive back to Jim's farm was tense. The sun had begun to set, casting the sky in hues of pink and gold, But Elise barely noticed the beauty of the evening. Her mind was preoccupied with the questions swirling in her head. Who had sent the message? How much did they know? And most disturbingly, what lengths would they go to stop her? As they pulled into Jim's driveway, the old farmer was once again on his porch, rocking slowly in his chair, his rifle still resting nearby. He watched them approach, his expression unreadable, though Elise noticed a flicker of recognition in his eyes when he saw the look on her face. "Back so soon?" Jim asked, though there was no surprise in his voice. "We need to talk," Elise said, stepping out of the truck. "Something's happened." Jim raised an eyebrow, but didn't respond, motioning for them to sit on the porch steps. Once seated, Elise showed him the message on her phone. Jim squinted at the screen for a moment, then leaned back in his chair, letting out a low whistle. "That's some serious business," he said, his tone grim. "I was afraid of something like this." "What do you mean?" Max asked, his voice sharp with urgency. Jim sighed, his gaze drifting out over his overgrown fields. "I've seen things like this before. Not around here, but back when I was younger. In the bigger towns, in places where people didn't ask questions. When rich folks or powerful people are involved, they'll do anything to keep their hands clean, even if it means scaring people into keeping quiet. Who you think is behind this?" Elise pressed. "Is it the Huxleys? Are they back? Or is it someone else?" Jim shook his head slowly. "I don't know about the Huxleys. Like I told you, they up and left years ago. But that doesn't mean someone else didn't move in. Whoever's behind this operation, they're organized. They got money, connections, and they're willing to do whatever it takes to keep folks like you from getting too close." Elise felt a knot form in her stomach. She had known this was dangerous, but hearing it from Jim made it feel all the more real. "Have you seen anything else?" she asked. "Anything unusual around the Huxley property?" Jim paused for a long moment, his fingers tapping on the arm of his chair. "I didn't want to say anything earlier because, well, I didn't want to get involved. But the truth is, I've seen more than just those black SUVs." Elise and Max exchanged a glance. "What else have you seen?" Max asked, his voice tense. Jim hesitated, then leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice as if afraid someone might be listening. "Late at night, I've seen trucks, big ones, the kind used for transporting livestock. They come and go quick, never stay long. I thought it was odd, but I didn't want to start asking questions. Whoever's running this operation, they're moving animals in and out of that place. And it ain't just horses." Elisa's pulse quickened. "What do you mean? What else are they moving?" "I don't know for sure," Jim admitted. "But the animals they're moving, they're not local. They're exotic, from what I can tell. I've heard strange sounds coming from those trucks. Animals I'd never heard around these parts. That's when I knew it wasn't just some run-of-the-mill livestock trade. Exotic animals. That changed everything." Elisa's mind raced. This wasn't just about horses. This was something much larger, potentially an international operation smuggling rare and endangered species. The scope of it made her stomach churn. How had something like this been happening under everyone's noses? "Why didn't you tell anyone?" Elise asked, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "You could have stopped this." Jim looked at her, his eyes dark and weary. "You don't understand, Elise. I've lived long enough to know that there are some fights you can't win. If I'd said anything, I might have ended up in a ditch somewhere, and so might you if you're not careful." The warning sent a shiver down Elise's spine. Jim was afraid, truly afraid. And now she understood why. This operation was bigger, more dangerous than she had ever imagined. But backing down wasn't an option. Not now. "We're going to expose them," Elise said, her voice firm. "Whatever it takes." Jim shook his head, looking at her with a mixture of admiration and pity. "I hope you know what you're getting yourself into, girl. This ain't just about saving some animals anymore. You're up against people who'll do anything to keep their secrets hidden." Max, who had been silent for most of the conversation, finally spoke up. "We'll be careful, but we can't just walk away from this." Jim sighed again, then stood up slowly, his joints creaking with the effort. "You're stubborn, just like your folks. All right then. I'll help you as much as I can, but you've got to promise me something." Elise looked at him expectantly. "You get too deep, you get out. Don't try to be a hero. Heroes don't last long in situations like this." Elise nodded, though deep down she knew that once she was in, there would be no getting out. The web of danger was tightening around them, and they were running out of time. Into the lion's den. The night felt heavier than usual as Elise and Max drove back from Jim's farm. The winding country road, bathed in the dim glow of their headlights, seemed to stretch endlessly into the dark horizon. Elise gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white, her mind racing with the implications of what Jim had told them. Exotic animals, secretive operations, and threats veiled in shadows. It all pointed to something much larger than they had initially suspected. Exotic animals, Max muttered beside her, as if tasting the words on his tongue. If that's true, this isn't just some illegal horse trade. This is smuggling on an international scale. We could be looking at a full-blown wildlife trafficking ring. Elise nodded, her thoughts spinning. We have to find a way in. We need evidence, something solid to take to the authorities. Right now, we've got a lot of suspicion, but not enough proof. If they're moving exotic animals, there's got to be more going on in that old Huxley estate. We need to get closer. Max glanced at her, his expression one of concern and determination. Closer how? We can't just walk in there and ask for a tour. If they've got trucks coming in at night, they've probably got security, people who won't hesitate to deal with trespassers. Elise bit her lip, thinking. Max was right. Whoever was running this operation wasn't going to leave things to chance. They had already shown they were willing to send threats, and Jim's warning about being careful echoed in her mind. But she couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. More animals could be suffering. More lives could be at stake. She couldn't sit back and do nothing. "There has to be a way," she said, her voice firmer than she felt. "We can't stop now, Max. We're too close." Max sighed, rubbing his hands over his face in frustration. "You know I'm with you, but we need to be smart about this. If we make one wrong move, we're done. And not just us. The people running this will cover their tracks so fast, we'll never get another shot." Elise's phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. She glanced down, her heart skipping a beat as she saw another message from the unknown number. Her hand trembled slightly as she picked up the phone and read the text. "Last warning. Walk away." Her breath caught in her throat. The message was simple, but the menace behind it was unmistakable. Max leaned over, his eyes narrowing at the sight of the words. "They're serious," he said, his voice low. "This isn't just a scare tactic anymore. They know we're not backing down." Elise nodded, her pulse racing. The fear was there, a cold, creeping sensation at the back of her mind. But beneath it was an even stronger resolve. They couldn't walk away. Not now. "We need to move fast," she said, her mind already shifting into problem-solving mode. "If they're onto us, they might try to shut everything down or move the animals out before we can get proof. We have to figure out what they're doing inside that estate, and we need to do it soon." Max studied her face for a moment, then nodded. "All right, but we need a plan." Elise thought about it, running through the options in her head. They couldn't go to the police, not without solid evidence, and if they just waited, the operation could vanish overnight. The estate was too well guarded for a simple break-in, but they had to find a way to see what was going on behind those walls. Then it hit her. "The trucks," she said, turning to Max. "Jim said they come at night, right? What if we wait for one of the trucks to come through? We could follow it, see where it goes inside the estate. Maybe we can find a weak spot in their security, something we can use to sneak in." Max frowned. "That's risky. If they catch us following them, I know, Elise said, her heart pounding. But we don't have a choice. We can't just sit back and wait for something to happen. Max was silent for a moment, then nodded. All right, let's do it. Later that night, Elise and Max parked their truck on a small dirt road just outside the Huxley Estate's perimeter. The estate was surrounded by thick woods, with only a narrow, overgrown path leading toward the main entrance. The old iron gates, long unused by the original owners, were now watched by security cameras and guarded by men in dark clothes. Even from their distance, Elise could make out the shadowy figures patrolling near the entrance, their movements cautious and deliberate. They're not taking any chances, Max whispered from the passenger seat, peering through the binoculars they'd brought. This is more than just a casual operation. They're protecting something big. Elise nodded, her eyes scanning the area. The road where they had parked wasn't far from the estate's main gate, and from here they had a clear view of the only path in and out of the property. The trucks Jim had mentioned would have to pass through here at some point. They waited in tense silence, the minutes ticking by slowly. Elise's nerves were on edge, every rustle in the trees and every distant sound making her jump. The moon hummed low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. Her mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, but she forced herself to stay focused. They couldn't afford to lose their nerve now. Just as she was beginning to wonder if they'd missed the trucks entirely, the faint sound of an engine caught her attention. She sat up straighter, motioning for Max to do the same. A moment later, a pair of headlights appeared in the distance, slowly making their way down the road. There, Max whispered, his voice tight with anticipation. Elise's heart pounded as the truck came into view. It was a large, unmarked vehicle, exactly the kind Jim had described. Its windows were tinted, and the back was covered, making it impossible to see what was inside. The truck slowed as it approached the gate, pausing briefly as one of the guards stepped forward to check something on a clipboard. After a few tense moments, the gates creaked open, and the truck rolled inside. "This is it," Elise said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We follow them in." Max looked at her, his expression a mix of determination and concern. "Are you sure about this? Once we're in there, we might not be able to get out if something goes wrong." Elise met his gaze, her resolve firm. "We have to do this, Max. We can't stop now." With a nod, Max climbed into the back of the truck, where they had stashed their gear, cameras, flashlights, and a small drone that Max had rigged with a night vision camera. Their plan was simple but dangerous. They would follow the truck through the woods on foot, using the drone to scout ahead and avoid detection. If they could get close enough to the estate, they might be able to capture footage of what was happening inside. The truck moved slowly, its taillights flickering through the trees as it followed the winding path toward the estate's heart. Elise and Max crept through the underbrush, staying low and moving quietly. Every step felt like a risk, every snapped twig or rustle of leaves, sending a jolt of adrenaline through Elise's veins. As they neared the estate's perimeter, Elise pulled out the drone and handed it to Max. "Get it in the air," she whispered. "We need to see what's ahead." Max nodded, quickly assembling the drone and launching it into the sky. They watched the small screen on his phone as the drone soared over the treetops, its night vision camera illuminating the landscape below. The estate came into view, a sprawling mansion, long abandoned and now repurposed for something far more sinister. Armed guards patrolled the grounds, and several more trucks were parked near the entrance. But it was what they saw behind the estate that made Elise's blood run cold. A massive makeshift enclosure stretched across the property, filled with cages, large metal cages that held animals of all shapes and sizes. Some were horses, but others were far more exotic: lions, tigers, even rare birds. The animals were crammed together in horrible conditions, their eyes wide with fear and confusion. "This is worse than I thought," Max whispered, his face pale as he stared at the screen. "They're running a full-on wildlife trafficking ring." Elise's heart pounded in her chest, a mix of anger and horror surging through her. They had the evidence they needed now, but getting it out of here was going to be the hardest part. "We have to get closer," she said, her voice steely. "We need more footage." Max nodded, guiding the drone closer to the enclosures. As the drone hovered above the cages, Elise's eyes locked onto something strange. In one of the larger cages, a group of men were gathered, speaking in hushed tones. One of them was holding a syringe, and another was jotting notes down on a clipboard. Elise's breath caught in her throat. "They're drugging the animals," she whispered. "God knows what they're planning to do with them." Suddenly, a shout rang out from one of the guards. Elise froze, her heart skipping a beat as the drone's feed flickered. One of the guards had spotted it, pointing toward the sky. "We've been seen," Max hissed, quickly pulling the drone back. "Run," Elise shouted, adrenaline surging through her as they bolted for the cover of the trees. Their hearts pounded in unison as they raced to escape the estate. But deep down, Elise knew they had just crossed a line they couldn't return from. The final showdown. The thick underbrush of the woods whipped past Elise and Max as they sprinted through the darkness. Adrenaline pulsed in Elise's veins, her breath ragged as they dodged trees and leaped over fallen branches. The drone's flickering footage on Max's phone showed them what they needed to see. Evidence of the illegal wildlife trafficking ring. But now they had been spotted. It was a race against time to escape before the guards caught them. Behind them, the sharp barking of dogs and the unmistakable shouts of men echoed through the forest. They were being pursued. "They're gaining on us," Max shouted, panting heavily as he struggled to keep pace. Elise's legs burned, but she couldn't stop now. The knowledge of what they had uncovered, the starving horses, the exotic animals trapped in cages, the drugging of innocent creatures, propelled her forward. Her heart ached for every living thing trapped in that estate, but she knew if they were caught, their efforts would be in vain. They needed to make it out with the evidence, or everything they'd done would be for nothing. "There's a stream up ahead," Elise yelled, remembering the layout from when they had scouted the area. "If we can cross it, we might lose them." Max nodded, his face pale with exhaustion. They pushed forward, hearing the rushing water as they neared the stream. The icy water hit Elise's legs as they plunged into the stream, but she didn't stop. With each step, she felt the pull of the current trying to sweep her off her feet, but she fought to maintain her balance. Max followed closely behind, splashing through the water as they scrambled toward the opposite bank. Behind them, the dogs' barking grew louder, but Elise couldn't afford to look back. Once they reached the other side, she pulled herself up the muddy embankment and turned, helping Max climb up after her. The sound of their pursuers grew fainter as the dogs hesitated at the edge of the stream, but she knew they didn't have much time. "We need to find cover," Elise said breathlessly, glancing around. The trees thickened ahead, offering more concealment. "If we can hide long enough, they'll lose our trail." Max nodded, barely able to catch his breath. They stumbled forward into the dense woods, moving slower now, trying to stay silent. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig underfoot felt like it would give them away, but the sounds of pursuit were fading. After what felt like an eternity, they found a small outcropping of rocks and crouched behind them. Elise's chest heaved as she struggled to control her breathing, her pulse still racing with fear. Max leaned back against the rocks, wiping sweat from his brow. "That was too close," he muttered, his voice shaking slightly. "I thought they had us." Elise nodded, but her mind was already racing ahead. "We can't stay here for long. They'll widen their search. We have to get this footage out now." Max glanced at his phone, checking the drone's memory. "We've got everything we need. Footage of the cages, the animals, the drugs, but we need to get it to someone who can actually do something with it. The police can't ignore this." Elise swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on her. They had the evidence, but now they had to get it to the right people, and fast. The men behind a wildlife trafficking ring were dangerous, well organized, and clearly willing to go to extreme lengths to protect their operation. The threats they had received were only the beginning. If they didn't act quickly, they could find themselves silenced before the truth came to light. "I know someone," Elise said, her voice steady but tense. "There's a journalist in town, Sarah Turner. She's been digging into corruption cases for years. She has contacts in law enforcement and knows how to handle sensitive information. If we can get the footage to her, she can blow this wide open." Max nodded, though his face was filled with doubt. "It's risky. If they've already got eyes on us, they might be watching everyone we talk to." "We don't have a choice," Elise replied, determination hardening her voice. "If we don't do this, those animals will die. More will suffer, and it won't stop. We have to trust that Sarah can get the word out." They spent the next hour moving carefully through the woods, avoiding the main roads and staying out of sight. Every sound made Elise's heart jump. Every shadow felt like another enemy lying in wait. But they managed to make their way back to where they had parked their truck, hidden off a dirt road miles from the estate. "Let's go," Elise whispered as they climbed into the truck, still drenched and dirty from their flight through the stream. The drive back to town was tense and silent. Elise kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights following them, or to find a roadblock waiting around the next bend. But the roads were empty, and the quiet night stretched on. Her fingers gripped the steering wheel tightly as they pulled into the outskirts of town. Sarah Turner's small house was tucked away in a quiet neighborhood, far enough from the center of town that it didn't draw attention. Elise parked a few blocks away, and they made their way through the shadows, knocking softly on the door. It opened almost immediately, revealing a tall, sharp-eyed woman in her late 30s. Sarah's gaze swept over Elise and Max, taking in their bedraggled appearance, before she stepped aside to let them in. "I figure I'd be seeing you soon," Sarah said, her voice low but calm. "I heard rumors about the Huxley estate, but I didn't have anything solid. You look like you've got the goods." "We do," Elise said, pulling out Max's phone. "You're not going to believe what we found." They sat down at Sarah's kitchen table, and Max began to show her the footage, frame by frame. The drone's view of the caged animals, the men with syringes, the trucks rolling in and out of the estate. Sarah's face darkened as she watched, her eyes narrowing. "This is big, bigger than I thought," she muttered. "If they're moving exotic animals through here, they've got connections overseas. This isn't just a local operation." "Exactly," Max said. "We need to blow this wide open. We need the authorities, the press, everyone." Sarah nodded, her mind already working through the next steps. "I can take this to my contacts, but we need to move fast. If they catch wind that we're onto them, they'll vanish. And if they know it's you who's behind this—" "We know," Elise interrupted, her voice firm. "We're ready. Just get this out there." Sarah gave them a long look, then nodded. "All right. I'll make some calls tonight. By tomorrow, this footage will be in the hands of every major news outlet in the region, and I'll make sure it gets to the right people in law enforcement. This operation won't stay hidden for long." Relief washed over Elise like a wave. It wasn't over, not by a long shot, but they had taken the first step. The animals in the Huxley estate might still be in danger, but now the world would know what was happening. As they prepared to leave, Sarah stopped them at the door. "Be careful. Once this story breaks, things might get dangerous for you. These people don't play around." Elise nodded, meeting Sarah's gaze with a hard look of her own. "We've been through danger already. We're not backing down." With that, they stepped back into the night, their hearts still heavy with the weight of what they had seen, but lighter with the knowledge that, finally, the truth would come out. 2 days later, Elise and Max sat together in their small living room, watching the news. The footage they had risked their lives to capture was now plastered across every major network, the shocking images of exotic animals crammed into cages causing outrage across the country. Law enforcement had raided the Huxley estate, arresting several key players in the trafficking ring. But as Elise watched the news anchors report on the arrests and the dismantling of the smuggling operation, she knew this was only the beginning. The ring was part of something much larger, something that would take time to fully unravel. There were still questions to be answered, and more people who needed to be brought to justice. But for now, she could breathe a little easier, knowing that they had made a difference. They had saved lives, and they weren't finished yet. Max leaned over and squeezed her hand. "We did it," he whispered. Elise smiled faintly, her eyes still on the screen. "Yeah, we did." But in her heart, she knew there would always be another fight, another battle to be won, and she was ready for it.